Today's topic is all about conflict and peacemaking. In this lesson, we will tackle what creates conflict and how can peace be achieved. To start off, conflict is a perceived incompatibility of actions or goals. Meanwhile, peace is a condition marked by low levels of hostility and aggression by mutually beneficial relationships. Social psychological studies have identified several ingredients of conflict. What's striking and what simplifies our task is that these ingredients are common to all levels of social conflict, whether intergroup, us versus them, or interpersonal, me versus us. Social dilemmas. Many problems that threaten our future, like nuclear arms, climate change, overpopulation, depleting fish stocks, natural resource depletion, arise as various parties pursue their self-interests, ironically, to their collective detriment. One individual may think, it would cost me a lot to buy expensive greenhouse emission controls. Besides, the greenhouse gases I personally generate are trivial. Many others reason similarly, and the result is a warming climate, melting ice cover, rising seas, and more extreme weather. A social trap is a situation in which the conflicting parties, by each rationally pursuing its self-interest, become caught in mutually destructive behavior. Now, let's consider two examples of a social trap, a situation when conflicting parties are caught in mutually destructive behavior, the prisoner's dilemma and the tragedy of the commons. The prisoner's dilemma derives from an anecdote concerning two suspects being questioned separately by the district attorney. The DA knows that they are jointly guilty but has only enough evidence to convict them of a lesser offense. So, the DA creates an incentive for each one to confess privately. If prisoner A confesses and prisoner B doesn't, the DA will grant immunity to A and will use A's confession to convict B of a maximum offense, and vice versa if B confesses and A doesn't. If both confess, each will receive a moderate sentence. If neither prisoner confesses, each will be convicted of a lesser crime and receive a light sentence. So if you were a prisoner faced with such a dilemma, with no chance to talk to the other prisoner, would you confess? A metaphor for the insidious nature of social dilemmas is what ecologist Gareth Hardin called the tragedy of the commons. He derived the name from the centrally located grassy pasture in Old English towns. In today's world, the commons can be air, water, fish, cookies, or any shared and limited resource. If all use the resource in moderation, it may replenish itself as rapidly as it's harvested. The grass will grow, the fish will reproduce, and the cookie jar will be restocked. If not, there occurs a tragedy of the commons. The tragedy occurs when individuals consume more than their share, with the cost of their doing so dispersed among all, causing the ultimate collapse, the tragedy of the commons. Competition. Hostilities often arise when groups compete for scarce jobs, housing, or resources. When interests clash, conflict erupts. Competition kindles conflict. In competition fostering situations, groups act more competitively than do individuals. To experiment on competition's effect, we could randomly divide people into two groups, have the groups compete for a scarce resource, and note what happens. That is precisely what Muzaffar Sharif in 1966 and his colleagues did in a dramatic series of experiments with typical 11 and 12-year-old boys. Perceived injustice. According to some social psychological theorists, people perceive justice as equity, the distribution of rewards in proportion to individuals' contribution. If you contribute more and benefit less than another person, you will feel exploited and irritated. You will be more sensitive to the inequity than the other person will be. Critics argue that equity is not the only conceivable definition of justice. Edward Sampson in 1975 argued that equity theorists wrongly assume that the economic principles that guide Western capitalist nations are universal. Some non-capitalist cultures define justice not as equity but as equality or even fulfillment of need. Karl Marx says, "From each according to his abilities, to each according to to his needs. Compared with individualistic Americans, people socialized under the influence of collectivist cultures, such as China and India, have defined justice more as equality or need fulfillment. Next is misperception. Recall that conflict is a perceived incompatibility of actions or goals. Many conflicts contain but a small core of truly incompatible goals. The bigger problem is the misperception of others' motives and goals. In early chapters, we considered the seeds of such misperception, such as self-serving bias, a tendency to self-justify, fundamental attribution errors, preconceptions, groups frequently polarizing self-serving, self-justifying, biasing tendencies. One symptom of groupthink is tendency to perceive one's own group as moral and strong, and the opposition as evil and weak. There's also the in-group bias and the negative stereotypes of the out-group. To a striking degree, the misperceptions of those in conflict are mutual. People in conflict attribute similar virtues to themselves and vices to the other. Mirror image perceptions are reciprocal views of each other, often held by parties in conflict. For example, each may view itself as moral and peace-loving and the other as evil and aggressive. When two sides have clashing perceptions, at least one is misperceiving the other. And when such misperception exists, noted Bronfenbrenner, it is a psychological phenomenon without parallel in the gravity of its consequences, for it is characteristic of such images that they are self-confirming. If A expects B to be hostile, A may treat B in such a way that B fulfills A's expectation, thus beginning the vicious circle. From exaggerated perception of the other's position arise culture wars. Ralph White in 1996 and 1998 reports that the Serbs started the war in Bosnia partly out of an exaggerated fear of the relatively secularized Bosnian Muslims, whose beliefs they wrongly associated with Middle Eastern Islamic fundamentalism and fanatical terrorism. Resolving conflict involves abandoning such exaggerated perceptions and coming to understand the other's mind, but that isn't easy, notes Robert Wright in 2003. Putting yourself in the shoes of people who do things you find abhorrent may be the hardest moral exercise there is. Group conflicts are often fueled by an illusion that the enemy's top leaders are evil, but their people, though controlled and manipulated, are pro-us. This evil leader, good people perception characterized Americans' and Russians' views of each other during the Cold War. The United States entered the Vietnam War believing that in areas dominated by communist Viet Cong terrorists, many of the people were allies in waiting. As suppressed information later revealed, those beliefs were mere wishful thinking. In 2003, the United States began the Iraq War, presuming the existence of a vast underground network that would rise in support of coalition forces to assist security and law enforcement. Alas, the network didn't materialize. The resulting post-war security vacuum enabled looting, sabotage, and persistent attacks on American forces.
At this point in time, we are going to talk about peace. How can peace be achieved? Sometimes we have conflict in life. We have conflicts. We have argumentations and fights with someone. We have seen how conflicts are ignited by social traps, competition, perceived injustices, and misperceptions. Although the picture is grim, it is not hopeless. Sometimes closed fists become open arms as hostilities evolve into friendship. Social psychologies focus on 4 peacemaking strategies, which we can remember as the 4 C's of peacemaking: contact, cooperation, communication, and conciliation. So the first C's is the contact. So contact, when tensions run high, contact may fuel a fight. But we have seen that proximity and the accompanying interaction and more exposure, like it's boost liking. Equal status contact is contact on an equal basis. To reduce prejudice, interracial contact should ideally be between persons equal in status. You might be putting two clashing people or bunches into near contact, empower them to know and like each other. Maybe not. We have seen how negative desires can bias judgments and make self-fulfilling predictions. When pressures run tall, contact may fuel a battle. But we have moreover seen that proximity and the ongoing with interaction, anticipation of interaction and simple exposure boost like you're enjoying. And we know how obtrusive racial partiality decline taking after integration, appearing that states of mind take after behavior. In the event that is a social psychological rule recently appears self-evident that we must always keep in mind that that's how things usually seem after you know them. Next is for the cooperation. The second C is cooperation. In all conflicts at all levels, from couple to tribal teams to nations, shared threats and common goals breed such unity. Such friendliness is common among those who experience a shared threat. Subordinate goals are a shared goal that is necessitates cooperative effort, a goal that overrides people's differences from one another. Given settled and threatening vibe, what can a peacemaker do? What you can do? Think back to the successful and unsuccessful integration endeavors. The Army's racial blending of rifle companies didn't fair bring blacks and whites into equal status contact. It made them interdependent. Together, they were battling a common adversary, endeavoring toward a shared objective. So the third C, let's proceed to the third C, is the communication. Conflict parties have other ways to resolve their differences. So first, let's talk about bargaining. Bargaining. It's like seeking an agreement to a conflict through direct negotiation between parties. Mediation. An attempt by a natural third party to resolve a conflict by facilitating communication and offering suggestions. Integrative agreements is when win-win agreements that reconcile both parties' interests to their mutual benefit. And for arbitration is a resolution of a conflict by a neutral third party who studies both sides and imposes a settlement. Communication, the clashing parties have other ways to resolve their contrast. When spouse and wife or labor and administration or country X or country Y oppose this idea, they can deal with each other straightforwardly. They can inquire a third party to intercede by making proposals and facilitating their transactions. Or like they can referee by submitting their contradiction to somebody who will think about the issues and the force of a settlement. And lastly, the last C that we are going to talk about is the conciliation. GREET is an acronym for a graduated and reciprocated initiatives in tension reduction. GREET is a strategy designed to escalate international tensions. GREET aims to reverse the conflict spiral by triggering reciprocal de-escalation. It requires one side to initiate a few small de-escalatory actions after announcing a conciliatory intent. The initiator states its desire to reduce tension, declares such conciliatory act before making it, and invites the adversary to reciprocate. In some cases, pressure and doubt run so tall that indeed communication, let alone resolution, gets to be all but inconceivable. Each party may debilitate, coerce, or strike back against the other. Tragically, such acts tend to be responded, raising the struggle. So, would a procedure of conciliating the other party by being unequivocally agreeable create a satisfying result? Frequently not. In research facilities, recreations, those who are 100% cooperative often are abused. Politically, a one-sided pacifism is as a rule out of the address. And that ends our topic for conflict and peacemaking. Thank you and stay safe as always.